everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. We're all about boxing and history. On this podcast, we're welcoming in a new year, 2023, but I'm back with my boy, Brin-Jonathan Butler, author, filmmaker, and we're here to talk some boxing history. Bro, how are you?
I'm really good. We're looking back at one of my favorite fights from actually 25 years ago. It just seems crazy. It's that long ago.
I keep do this every time we go back at one of these fights, and it's a fight that I either remember or I remember the time frame. I'm just kind of like, really? Am I that old? Yeah, I am. Sucks, but this was an incredible fight that it didn't encapsulate 90s heavyweights because there's so much happening apart from these two guys.
Yeah.
But they were kind of like the new breed, the new generation, ushering in kind of like the end of that old Tyson Holyfield. Well, Lewis was still reigning, obviously, but Foreman, Moorer, all those guys generation. And so we got Ike Ibeabuchi and David Tua clashing and I mean, dude, combining to throw an insane amount of punches, just disgusting amount of punches.
Yeah, I mean, as much as people talk about the thrill in Manila, this does considerably more punches. This, by the 10th round, does more punches than a fight that was going on at the time between Oscar De La Hoya and Pernell Whitaker. It does way more punches than Bo Holyfield too. So it's interesting because I mean one of the things that's intriguing about this fight for me is you think if this was a heavyweight championship, instead of two guys just on the way up where it's a kind of crucible to establish that they're as good as we think they might be, especially Tua. Tua was heavy favorite in this fight. Not a heavy favorite, but a favorite in this fight. It's just it happened at a really interesting point in their careers, and I think one takeaway from this is that it really derailed Ibeabuchi as it ascended him at the same time. And the other just weird thing I'm not used to is I was 18 when I watched this fight. It was a TV fight because it was HBO Boxing After Dark. It happens June 7th, 1997 in Sacramento. Both of these guys are undefeated. Tua is 27-0 with 23 knockouts. Ibeabuchi is 16-0, 12 knockouts. Ike didn't have much of a resume he just looked amazing. And he's called the president, which is just an awesome nickname. But Tua, I think a lot of us, I mean, he just bears such a resemblance to Tyson in so many ways with his tremendous left hook. But we'd also seen him on that boxing, like the night of the young heavyweights. And we knew that John Ruiz was somebody formidable in that crew of fighters. And Tua taking him out in 10 seconds, we can just all hear.
Well, I don't want to split hairs. It was like 19 seconds, but still, that's not like.
But like the knockout itself, I think was within 10 seconds.
Oh yeah, I think yes, they included a part of the count, so yeah. It's like it was pretty fucking immediate. Is the point?
It was just jaw dropping. It was just a really bizarre. Like, how does this happen? This isn't supposed to happen this easily. Because I mean, we know with like as Tyson and the talent stepped up, he couldn't do what he was doing against like Mercedes and the early sort of guys where it becomes this like Rocky 3 highlight reel. So Tua was just, can he be this good? Because he just looks like a tank. And so coming into this fight, my memory of it from 25 years ago, I haven't watched it from start to finish since then at 18, was that this was completely a showcase for Ibeabuchi. And Ibeabuchi were just kind of, he was the big what if. What would he have done to Lewis? What would he have done to that stable of 1990s heavyweights if he was a player? Who the hell what would he have done to Holyfield? Like sort of thing. As Bo did the damage he did, what would Ibeabuchi have done with his conditioning, with his stamina, his endurance, his punch selection? But rewatching this, I was like, it's Tua who stands out. I gave it to Tua by a wide margin in this rewatching, whereas my memory of it was that Ibeabuchi had a wide margin victory. So I'm not used to that going back to fights. Usually I'm fairly consistent with my scoring, but it was kind of a revelation where after the first few rounds, it's Tua backing him up and sort of taking control, not dominating, but taking control for the majority of the fight, despite the fact that it's Ibeabuchi who holds an individual record that still stands for most punches thrown by a
Yeah,
heavyweight.
it's pretty amazing stuff, dude, because there's a lot of things going on outside of the ring leading up to the fight with both fighters. I remember in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, right when message boards and forums were kind of starting to take over bulletin board systems. Yeah, I'm fucking old, bros. Come on. I've been around a bit. Bulletin board systems were some 90s ass shit, dude. Was basically just you leave a message, and similar to a forum, but just set up differently. But I remember in the early days of boxing forums and message boards, prominent things that you would see as far as threads or arguments would be like, when is Mike Tyson coming back to take over the heavyweight division?
Yeah.
When's Prince Nassim coming back? When's he coming back? And another thing was, where could Ike, is Ike Ibeabuchi getting out of prison? When's he getting out of prison? And how quickly can he take over the heavyweight division when he does? And that was like that shit would be like a weekly. We'd go over that and we'd be like, go back to this thread. Somebody already brought it up last week because it was all the time, because that's how formidable he looked, not just in this fight. And excuse me, even having him losing this fight, as I did as well, he still looked extremely formidable because that's how good David Tua looked in spots. But we were talking about as we before we started recording, just how different this fight looked from your average heavyweight fight now. And I mean, to be fair, it looked different from your average heavyweight fight then too. It stood out then, but it really stands out now, because you're seeing things from two heavyweights that you just don't really see from contemporary heavyweights overall.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think what this fight, rewatching it, made me think about is, as the three big heavyweight figures that we have, leaving out Usyk, but I mean, just before Usyk entered that picture of champions, where it was like they were all undefeated, Fury, Wilder, Joshua, and the idea that Fury beating Wilder 3 times and really beating him every round that he wasn't knocked down by many judges scoring, including mine. Suddenly a lot of people are like, he's the best heavyweight who ever lived. Have we ever seen a better heavyweight than this? As if beating the same guy 3 times should allow for that kind of opinion. And I'm not trying to take anything away from Fury. I think he's a tremendous fighter. I think would be so complicated for any heavyweight to beat. But it is important.
But that thought can exist in the same mind of somebody who says that he's really good, but he's not that good.
No,
point directly to these guys and say, with all due respect, he's not that good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think if you had a figure like Michael Grant coming up at the same time, who on his way up, there were talks, like you're saying, like, if Tyson isn't going to take over the heavyweight division, who's the next Tyson? Is it Tua? Is it Michael Grant, who has the same people around him? Yeah, I think he had Bill Payton managing him, which Tommy Morrison also had. So there's all this kind of like trying to recreate the myth, recreate the ride.
You basically just did an HBO boxing intro from like 1996. Who is the next great heavyweight?
Exactly.
That's pretty much what that was.
So I think these guys auditioning for that role, which is really the reason they're trying to petition for that, is so that HBO can sell more fights, like get more money. Is nobody sold tickets like Tyson. You didn't really care who he was fighting. It was sort of like Arturo Gatti. It's when is Gatti fighting, not who is he fighting. That's a rare category for any heavyweight to have. Even Tyson Fury doesn't have that. Joshua doesn't have that. Wilder doesn't have that. We're asking, who are they going to fight? And so I just thought it was really interesting to think, if both of these guys were coming up in their prime, they're both 24 when they're fighting here. They are young, they're undefeated, they're knocking out the vast majority of their competition, and they both have dynamite in both fists and can throw this kind of output regularly, because it's not like this is the only fight Tua ever did this. Tua against, I think it was David Izonate, was in a top 5 all-time punches for heavyweights as well. So when Tua was in shape, and it's interesting to look back at Tua, like the Tua coming out of the Olympics that won the bronze medal is a little guy compared to where he's headed. And then he just blows up really after this fight, where he's really struggling to be under 250 after this, for the most part. I mean, you mentioned like he has an interesting body for a heavyweight. We don't see it that much. He's not that big upper body wise relative to his lower body, but he's able to just generate such torque with his hook. I mean, his right hand is a really weird right hand. It looks like a catapult, the way it sort of flings over the
Yeah,
top.
he just like, he's got a weird trajectory to it where there's not much, they teach you to throw it from your chin to, get that
Yeah.
straight kind of driving for it, but he just gets that whipping overhand back,
Yeah. And he's
it's
not a
weird.
big, and a lot of it, I mean, he and I have about the same, we're the same height, we're the same reach. We're about 5'10" with a 70-inch reach. It is unbelievably frustrating to fight guys who are over 6'2" or 6'3" with a considerable reach. And Ibeabuchi doesn't have a great reach. He has a 76-inch reach, which is still formidable, but to land a right hand is really hard if you're a little guy, if you're little stature with little reach against somebody that can keep you off of them. So it's another feature of this fight, it being in the phone booth, where oddly Ike is able to smother Tua's left hook, his best weapon, throughout most of the first half of the fight. And it should be the other way around. You shouldn't be smothered if you're the shorter guy and you're on the inside. But it's a credit to Ibeabuchi's infighting in this, that Tua can throw everything inside. He is a beautiful, vicious uppercut inside. He throws a lot of body punches, but every time he's throwing anything, especially anything that lands, that he kind of leans into and commits to, he's getting a flurry in return, which is leading to Ike's huge punch output, because he's really able to keep Tua off and contain and control him at the beginning with just his ability and willingness to engage in big numbers. So it's a fascinating fight on a lot of levels, and I would wish these guys were in the mix today, because it does remind you just how strong the division was in the 1990s, where, I mean, I just was compiling like a little list of the guys. You have Lennox Lewis, you have Holyfield, you have Michael Moore, you have Foreman, you have Tyson, sort of, a different Tyson post-prison, Riddick Bowe, Ray Mercer, Tommy Morrison, Galata, Ruddick, Michael Grant, and an interesting figure who looms over this, at least for me, is how does the stock of Felix Sabone not go through the roof after seeing what happens to Tua here and against Chris Bird?
I mean,
Or I mean, Ibeabuchi against Chris Bird as well.
I think that David Tua was, I want to say 18 when Savone knocked him out. Was it the Goodwill Games or something?
No, the Olympics. It was 92.
Was it the Olympics? And I mean, it wasn't like a clean knockout either. It was a very good punch, but he got up. He was very wobbly. The fight should have been stopped for sure. But he was young. Savone was a very seasoned fighter. So, I mean, you kind of have to put that into some context. However, yeah, even just how much Tua changed from then.
Yeah.
You can see him just as a straightforward fighter, doesn't have a whole lot of nuance to him, and he's also considerably smaller. He picked up a decent amount of mass, and so there's, like I said at the start, there's a lot of stuff going on outside of the ring. And one of the other things going on with David Tua, he got picked up by main events. So throughout, he got guided by main events. One of his trainers he had Roger Bloodworth, Lou Duva in his corner, and he had a couple other throughout the years too. But I remember talking to Nicole Duva, like we had her on the show like years and years ago, and she was telling anecdotes about how, for instance, when she like went to homecoming, her date came to pick her up, and Holyfield and Tua and a couple other guys were over at her house and scared the shit out of her date, stuff like that. When Holyfield is getting ready to beat Tyson in their first fight, David Tua is his chief sparring partner to kind of emulate Mike Tyson. And on top of that, that kind of got around, like rumors that, who is this guy that, because he had been on TV, people had seen him here and there, and especially in Australia, he had been on TV in Australia a lot in his early career, but he was less known in the US, and he got a lot of mileage out of that kind of like, he was sparring with Holyfield for Tyson shit. And so he had a lot of momentum behind him. like you said earlier, he was the favorite coming into this. And so the story behind this fight, just to kind of briefly get into it, was that according to Lou DiBella, who was the person who was putting together the vast majority of these fights for Boxing After Dark at this time, because Boxing After Dark had just developed the year before that. So this was in the earlier years of Boxing After Dark. Basically, like you had mentioned, Ibeabuchi was pretty much unknown. Nobody really knew who he was. He had a weird name to a lot of people. All they knew is that he looked scary and he was undefeated. But they were looking for opponents for David Tua because they'd basically run out of credible opponents for David Tua. Cedric Kushner was one of the guys who was supplying a lot of the heavyweights for these heavyweight explosion cards and the Boxing After Dark cards. And so basically they were running out of opponents for David Tua. Somebody had suggested, I think it was Bob Spagnola, Ike Ibeabuchi's manager, had suggested Ibeabuchi, and they were like, nah, we don't want this guy. And so then somebody had basically talked the Duvas main events into putting him in there because they just needed to keep David Tua busy. And so they put him in there with Ibeabuchi. And Ibeabuchi's story was basically just that, again, unknown, and that he had been on TV a few times but was unimpressive on his TV outings to that point. Those were his decisions. Was that those were just happened to be the fights that went to decision. And so people were like, okay, he looks scary, but he's not really fighting that scary. So they were able to talk the Duvas into accepting Ibeabuchi as an opponent. So I mean, that's kind of how this wound up getting put together, was that it was, just a random fight that just got put together kind of out of necessity. That's what's crazy. But anyway,
and I just to add, I mean, that night of the young heavyweights, that's March of '96. That really established two things: that the fighter who was showcased on that card was Shannon Briggs. Shannon Briggs had the big HBO special. There's some really funny moments to revisit there where it's like, Shannon Briggs is not your conventional heavyweight. He speaks French. And automatically they cut to Briggs being like, Je m'appelle Shannon Briggs. And they just move on. And it's clearly they're trying to position him. He has Teddy Atlas in his corner. Tyson is being mentioned all the time about who you need to think about this guy to contextualize him, which, by the way, was the same thing that happened to Mike Tyson on the way up. Your grandparents missed Rocky Marciano or Joe Louis. Your dad missed Muhammad Ali. Do not miss Mike Tyson. And eventually people started buying into that to go, wow, what if it's true? This guy could be really, really special. So HBO was trying to repeat the formula. And so you had Shannon Briggs going into it clearly as the number one fighter they're showcasing, who gets blown away in his fight, totally exposed. It's awful. As he told me, if I won Teddy Atlas, it was we won. And as soon as I lost, according to Teddy Atlas. And then the other big takeaway was...
And then he pulls a gun on you.
Yeah. And then the other huge takeaway was that I think Ruiz Tua was sort of like, wow, this is going to be a great fight. And Tua just has the announcer screaming with excitement, like, wow, what have we just witnessed? This guy is somebody extraordinary. So I think everybody who watched that night was like, when can I see David Tua fight next? Because Ruiz was not just like a pushover tomato can by any stretch. He's going to go on his way to becoming heavyweight champion, have wars with Evander Holyfield and many others. And Tua very quickly, if you look at his fights in the lead up to Ibeabuchi, is we saw him fight Darrell Wilson, who knocked out Shannon Briggs. Tua knocks him out in one round. He fights David Izon in kind of a war. And the knockout finish of that, it's a TKO stoppage.
That was a come from behind. Like, he needed that knockout, and he was like trudging along doing the best he could, and it was like, he's kind of falling behind. Oh shit! Like,
yeah, vicious, like just vicious. Like, there's something about watching a Tua fight when he's hurting people that you're cringing as he lands punches. There's, like they said about Tyson, that his punches sounded different on a bag. Tua's sound different on a head. They sound different on a body. There's something about it where you're like, wow, but I find myself involuntarily going, oh, all I can think about now, maybe again, it's an aging thing, is the headache that poor guy is going to have the next day or for the rest of his life, as it were. And then there was a great fight right before Ibeabuchi, back in the days when people used to fight regularly. Oleg Maskiev is an extraordinary TKO knockout in the 11th round. So I think we were just going like, can he just keep doing this? Which was the same question that people were asking with Tyson on the way up. Can he just keep steamrolling major opponents? And then he runs into Ibeabuchi, and especially in the first few rounds, it's like the tables are really turned on what expectations are for this fight, because you're just going, I don't know that Tua has ever seen anything like this. And certainly Ibeabuchi has never seen anything like David Tua with his like far lesser resume, but Ibeabuchi seemed a lot more composed dealing with it. And as I say, it feels like a great heavyweight championship fight in just the mood of it, except it's the opposite. It's two guys that really don't have an established resume, which makes this fight kind of strange and stand out in a weird way.
It's definitely a kind of a sort of showbox like level almost type of fight where it's like it's almost there's a crossroads where all right, somebody's going to lose. We have no idea where the loser is going to go, but the winners pretty much got only one way to go, and that's up. And that's the kind of fight that it was. And I mean, I guess even on paper, it looked like that kind of fight. But man, once they got in there, it's an incredible fight, and it's also a very strange fight, though, in my opinion. So, like you said earlier, when you start the fight out, already you can tell, like, all right, this is not your run of the mill, like 2020s heavyweight fight where there's a bunch of sloppy fucking trudging and holding and flopping and draping and colliding. But they're both starting out punching, and they're both starting out throwing like, hard punches. They're not fucking around. But Ike Ibeabuchi, if you've never seen him before and like this is your introduction, I mean, there's copies of Ibeabuchi Tua all over YouTube at this point, so you can see it. But if you've never watched him before and this is your first introduction and you're watching him, you're like, that's a large guy and he's throwing a lot of punches. I mean, he's a large fellow and he's scary looking and he's punching a lot. And it's really keeping David Tua on his back foot. And you could tell that Tua's kind of thinking, trying to work it out, bobbing and weaving, avoiding a lot of the incoming, but really not doing a ton back. He was far too passive and inactive, I thought. That doesn't mean that I thought that, he deserved to lose, but he was far more passive and inactive than he should have been in the first few rounds. But even so, it was more a testament to how busy Ike was and how much he was moving about, that Tua still was moving his hands. It was just that Ike was overwhelming him.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if you compare it to, a recent great fight by everybody's estimation, like Fury Wilder 3, one of the interesting things, as you're saying, is like these guys look extremely coordinated. Like I think Wilder has the greatest weapon I've ever seen implemented in a fight in my life, that right hand. In sparring, it is incredible what he can do, where he is completely dominated by sparring partners. And then all of a sudden you see him throw that punch where he can cross the entire ring with it, with this kind of leverage. Everything else he does looks like an uncoordinated giraffe or something, the way he walks around, but he has this tremendous weapon. But when you're watching both of these guys, they're so poised. All the punches have such leverage. The way they can take punches seems different from guys today. I don't know why.
They're not falling all over. Like they're tight, composed, like it's like, it's textbook.
So durable. Like it looks like a fight from the 1940s. Like it's a fight that while you're watching, you're like, why is it in color? Shouldn't this be black and white? Like, this is not how people are supposed to fight anymore. This is what they used to do back then.
Like how HBO did for the Gotti Ward rematch.
Right. Right. And so there's something interesting about that, where it's like anytime Anthony Joshua gets hit by something from a heavyweight, he falls down. Every time Wilder gets hit by something, he is really wobbled. These guys are never wobbled in this entire fight, really. You can see it affects them because they're throwing bombs, but they're never wobbled. And you're like, what is it about that? Like, what's different? So yeah, you're absolutely right in the first fight. I mean, Tua is controlled by Ibeabuchi, and Ibeabuchi is undefeated. He's not quite the puncher that Tua is, but he can throw in volume in a way that Tua just doesn't need to. So it's interesting just to see the punch selection also that Tua has to contend with defensively. Tua's not a bad defensive fighter. He neither of these guys demonstrate much foot speed. That's an interesting facet here that I think we can appreciate Tyson a little bit more, is that Tyson became this post-prison, where he's got really fast hands and he comes forward and he can try to catch you with a feint or something. Pre-prison, Tyson can punch with both hands, is swinging to both sides. He's got his shift. He is just as comfortable working from a southpaw position as a conventional stance, and loves to find angles in a fluid way rather than creating things, set things. When you're watching both of these guys, I don't think they tried to find an angle against each other once in the entire fight. It's get into the pocket and then just try to outswing on the person or wait for them to hit you and then throw a flurry back. Nothing wrong with it, but it can make you appreciate the levels in boxing. Is go back and watch Tyson doing this. He's never in front of you to be hit, and he's countering in ways that's why he's getting these great knockouts. These guys don't have that level, so instead it's like a 18th century naval battle where we need to get in front of each other and open fire, and that's the whole fight in the phone booth.
Yeah, it's fucking redcoats lining up in a line. Pop. All right. Yeah, it's there's not a ton of nuance to it in terms of creating angles or tricking or setting traps or anything like that. I mean, on a smaller level, yes, but one thing I did notice in the first round that made me feel nice about myself when they took them to like round 10 to fucking bring it up, the commentators. But one thing I did notice is that Ibeabuchi actually did a really, really good job, a surprisingly good job of staying at a range that was just perfectly awful for Tua. Where he was making it so that he was jabbing from the outside pretty much every single round. He started out probably like, between 20 and 30 seconds of jabbing on the inside. And what happened from there, largely determined who won the round. But early on, he was jabbing, doing well from the outside. And then as soon as the fight started, like, the distance started closing, he was like locked onto Tua, like, right in close so that Tua could not get that hook off. And so one thing Tua actually started doing was digging to the body with his right hand. And I mean, those were some nasty shots, man. They mentioned him a few times, like the commentators, but he did it pretty consistently, actually. And it wasn't until later in the fight, but he did it that it kind of affected Ibeabuchi, but he did it consistently throughout the fight. And man, that was a nasty shot. He's got this really like digging, like right hand to the body that's, not a straight, but just a really, man, he gets so much leverage. Like you see a fucking, a lot of these dudes who are like just slamming home runs in baseball are dudes who have massive trunks. Like not the skinny, Tommy Hearns looking dudes. Generally, those are not the home run power hitters. Generally, the power hitters are these fools who are fucking massive in their midsection and are creating that kind of torque, just like David Tua.
Cecil Fielder back in the day.
Just crushing fucking balls out of the fucking stadium, that type of shit. I mean, well, and steroids too, but regardless, I mean, perhaps less so Cecil Fielder, but regardless, just the thick, that body type creates a lot of torque and a lot of twisting torque. And man, David Tua really knows how to get going with that shit. And anyway, so Ike Ibeabuchi, great round one, but still a very entertaining round one, but it was clearly heading in his direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Ike is throwing at about a rate of twice the heavyweight average of punches. Both of these guys have extraordinary punch selection for guys their size. I mean, as you're saying about Tua, his body attack, but Ibeabuchi is also throwing to the body. He has a kind of unique leverage to his punches also. You'll see it later on in his last fight against Chris Bird, where you have one of the, I think, the most iconic knockouts of the 1990s. That fight, I think, is 1999, so it's what, 2 years after this one. This sort of, it's not like a Ruddock, like the uppercut hook, but it's something there. It's at a peculiar angle that, full credit to Bird to get up. I don't know how he got up from that shot because the leverage was just insane.
Yeah, it starts at his fucking toes,
Yeah, it does. It starts at his toes. It looks like a 600-foot home run off of Bird's face, like just off of his jaw.
And he gets up and says, "I'm all right," with spit hanging off him and stuff. I'm okay.
No, it's amazing. But Ibeabuchi is, yeah, as you say, smothering Tua in a way that is unusual because nobody up to that point was able to smother Tua's hook. He always found a way to get it off. And as we're saying, it's
you try to run away from it, and then he catches you leaping, running away. It's like you can't do it.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the way that he knocked out Ruiz. He is jumping. I mean, it's like Little Mac in Punch Out jumping to hit his opponent's face. But even when he's jumping, the leverage that he's able to uncork with it is extraordinary. And so, yeah, it's something to watch Tua in this fight, try to figure out. And he rarely gets credit for this, but Tua is not dominated in the first 3 rounds, but he's really controlled in an unusual way. And he's able to figure some things out and have the mental toughness to stay in there and resolve. I mean, his determination, his willpower, and I mean, probably the last thing we ever hear about David Tua, his conditioning. His conditioning is really remarkable. Again, watch Wilder, who's probably got 5%, 6% body fat, is out of breath after the first round against Fury.
Yeah, just gasping.
He's just, I don't know what it is about him. Where is this condition? Look at Anthony Joshua. Why is he always out of breath after the first round? And you watch these guys that have similar kind of big builds, and they're just going and going and going, even though they're both taking a lot of punishment in this fight. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, early in this fight, you have Ibeabuchi at a gear that we've just not seen anybody his size punch because nobody has ever done it. And Tua is frustrated, but not, you can see on his face that he's not losing his determination either. That's a great thing about Floyd Mayweather is at some point in every Mayweather fight, you saw the opponent's face go, I don't know what to do. And I start wasting my energy in frustration of that problem. I don't know what the tool is to solve this puzzle.
Yeah.
He keeps hitting me, and I know I'm losing rounds.
Yeah.
And
you're wasting energy trying to find the solution rather than wasting energy working on the solution, like having it and working on it. Yeah. So
that's it. So both these guys, it's funny that they're in it in a way that it's like there's no concern whatsoever about if this goes 12 rounds and we're going at this pace. Oh my God. It's like it's like it never crossed their mind of being concerned about their conditioning, despite the fact that they're on their way to blazing to a record. That's a weird feature of this fight because nowadays Joshua, after Ruiz, it's like, well, he's going to become a different kind of fighter that's more composed, that recognizes his limitations and that sort of thing. You have to make these adjustments.
Fucking life epiphany or something like that. And these guys are like, fuck it, let's just throw.
Yeah. And I kept thinking also, I mean, as much as Tua was talked about as the next Tyson, to me, he looks a lot more like the next Joe Frazier because they both have weird right hands. I think Tua has a better right hand than Joe Frazier, which is not saying much. Not trying to denigrate Joe Frazier. Love him, but couldn't tie his shoes with the right hand, as was said.
His right hand was just not good.
But Tua just has a different punch selection than Frazier. I think he has a little bit more of a sophisticated attack in terms of his options and his willingness to throw different punches. But I do see just similarities. If you take away Frazier's hook, he's really in trouble. And another feature of this fight, unlike the Thrilla and Manila, which it's so closely linked with in terms of punch output, is that Frazier frequently with Ali was always held down, pinned down the way Lewis would do to opponents. For some reason, Ibeabuchi never does that once to Tua. He never uses his height to push him down the way every tall fighter should be taught to deal with a smaller fighter. It never happens in this. The smothering that we're talking about is about them coming into close proximity, not about the levels of height and using that over one another. So it allows for a much more interesting fight. Maybe this is instructive for referees to allow guys to fight in a way that they don't penalize that the way they should, because you just cannot fight somebody that's allowed to hold you down if they're taller than you in that way. So it's
Yeah,
an interesting
yeah.
feature.
There are certain kinds of things that fighters can do that can really stall out a fight or basically shut it down, that are more or less legal at this point. And yeah, that's one of those kinds of things where you often see fighters do that and they won't get penalized even after rounds and rounds and rounds of doing it. And luckily, that's not what happened here. Through the first few rounds, yeah, one of the funny things is that Tua is actually doing some things really well. He's doing some really good things even in those rounds he's losing. Like you said, that right hand. Ibeabuchi's basically taken the hook away. He's got his fucking right glove like plastered. That shit ain't moving, dude.
Really
But
disciplined.
he didn't throw his right hand a whole lot. And except for to throw a right uppercut, for some reason he was really like he just kept going to the right uppercut for some reason. And I mean, I get it. The guy's shorter, he's leaning in, but I mean, the consequences of it is like, dude, you can't, that ain't worth it. So, but for the most part, he's got his right glove really far up and he's taken Tua's hook away. And so Tua is doing some work with his right hand and he's doing good work with his right hand. It's just not quite enough to overcome what Ike Ibeabuchi is doing. One thing I did notice about Ibeabuchi, especially since you brought up Anthony Joshua, and we've talked about Anthony Joshua just being far too muscle bound.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed about Ibeabuchi's hook, though, is he doesn't really turn it over. Pretty much the entire fight, he doesn't really turn it over. And if he had, and you know what, maybe he was too muscle bound to really be able to turn it over. But if he had, I felt like maybe he could have done even a little bit better against Tua, because obviously with Tua throwing his hook, he was open for a hook. But I mean, obviously, like I said, it's a big risk. It's a big fucking risk hooking with a hooker, and that's how Ibeabuchi gets in trouble in round 4 and 5. Actually,
Yeah, you're right. I mean, another interesting thing about the posture of these two fighters I noticed is that Tua stands tall. Tua fights full height. And really he's rather rigid, his spine. He'll lean down in his legs, but he keeps his back really straight. And Ibeabuchi is always at an angle. He's fighting at about 2 o'clock. It's I don't know that it works to his detriment, but I wonder just in the way that they're throwing hooks at each other and punches, if this means something that impacted the fight in terms of landing hooks or uppercuts or that kind of thing. Is Tyson could kind of bend over, and ironically, what started Ibeabuchi's career was actually watching Tyson Douglas. And when Tyson is coming in low, it's different than how Tua does it to try to get inside. They have different approaches to get inside. Tua does not have the windshield wiper kind of peekaboo style to get in. There's more conventional way that he gets in, and he's just willing to sort of bully his way in a lot more.
yeah,
But Ibeabuchi, I just thought, because if you watch him in fights where he lands these things, he just takes people's heads off. And yet he's not able to land a lot on Tua, where, like, compare it to, say, Lennox Lewis on Tua, where Tua was completely controlled and took a fair bit of punishment in that fight. In this, it's more like they're just throwing not arm punches, but Ibeabuchi is a little hesitant to throw, like the way think about the punch he landed against Bird to take his head off. He's throwing a good 1.5 feet through the target as he's following through. It's like a baseball player, like with the full swing kind of thing. He's not doing that so much here. He's more concerned, smartly, I think, with throwing combinations and flurries.
mm-hmm.
I wonder, had he taken a different approach and tried to knock Tua out, if it would have had a better result or a worse result in terms of Tua being able to counter that.
Now that's a good question though, and it does kind of beg the question, in my opinion, too, is that like what happens with a guy like Tua if you're able to hurt him like in the first round, like if you're able to push him back and just fucking go at him and hurt him, and then all of a sudden it's like different ball game. Like, oh shit, like my whole thing was that I was going to be able to come at you, so what do I do now? But
Right.
but again, that's the fucking danger, is putting yourself in that position to be John Ruiz. Is it's bad news. But Ibeabuchi, yeah, he never really went all out like that, as he probably should not have. Um, After that third round,
Sorry.
no, it's okay. After that third round, Lou Duva starts going Lou Duva in between rounds and starts telling David Tua, you need to turn him around. You need to start, turning him around, which I take to mean inside rather than standing in front of him, like we've been talking about. Start using angles, start shifting, start doing something so that the angle changes, and you guys aren't just going, you go, then I go, then you go, then I go type of thing, because that's not the kind of fight we want. But he doesn't really start doing that in round 4 per se. It's just that he actually starts jabbing with Ibeabuchi, and then at the end of the round he starts really breaking through. And it was like all of a sudden toward the end of the 4th round, he's winning exchanges and getting closer and closer. In those moments in the preceding rounds, when Ibeabuchi is able to keep Tua off or able to smother him, Tua's breaking through in those moments more and more. He's starting to change the complexion of the fight a little bit. And on top of that, you're starting to see Ibeabuchi, like, that output is starting to drop, because it's like you can't throw 95 punches around when you're 250 pounds for very long. That ain't gonna go.
No, I mean, the tides turned for me. I gave the first 3 rounds to Ike. By the 4th round, Tua turns it around. And again, my memory of it was that Ike had more control than he did. Watching it this go round, it's hard for me to really even allow, like, for questionable rounds that might be even. Because I just thought Tua is backing him up. If you look at effective aggression, which is my own subjective way of scoring a puncher, is if you are dictating the pace of the fight and controlling the other fighter, even if he's throwing more punches, I don't really care. I'm thinking of the quality of the punches, and just that stupid Max Kellerman thing, which is not stupid, but I mean, who would you rather be?
That's a good way of putting it, I think.
Yeah. I just mean it sounds glib and sort of
Of course,
but
it's reductive, but it is kind of true.
But it is kind of true, and I'm not opposed to the other ways of scoring. I'm just sort of laying out how I do, but by the 4th round, Tua just suddenly looked like, I can deal with this. I'm not as concerned with what he's throwing back at me, and I'm finding some ways to get my hook out there. I'm not landing it the way I like, but Tua has his own version of willpower that I think is much better than Tyson's, for example. That when Tyson met adversity with an opponent, he was really frustrated by it. If he wasn't able to intimidate, he struggled to a degree. And fouled. And yeah, there's lots of character issues that were exposed in Tyson if he met opposition. If he wasn't able to sell you on how you should view this, and you were like, well, what's the fantasy versus the reality of this situation? If you could get to the reality of it, Tyson never met adversity where he didn't lose. If Tyson was backing up, he lost that fight every fight of his career. And Tua is not that way. Tua just has a different, where it's like, I'm just going to give my best. I don't care what you're bringing to this in terms of intimidating me or what your resume is. He just doesn't seem to give a shit. And I mean, I give him a lot of credit too, because going back to that Sabone thing, if you rewatch that fight, that was what the little glitch of sound was. I just want to see the 10 seconds of it as we're talking. He fights it exactly the way he fought Ruiz. He just jumps in there, and as he's jumping in there, he gets caught, and he gets knocked down twice by not even a very powerful right hand. It's just kind of a backing up right hand, but he falls twice, and yet he's still willing to fight exactly that same way against Ruiz, somebody with kind of a 6'4", big tall guy. So it's interesting to me that despite that Tua had faced some adversity with losing, with his style, somebody knocking him down. You don't think about other great fighters. Roy Jones Jr., before he was knocked out, had never been knocked down. He'd never been knocked down in sparring or anything like that.
I'm sorry, but that's not totally true. Lou Duval got him down.
Right. I mean, like,
but not like but that was like a flash knockdown.
Yeah.
He wasn't knocked down. Yeah.
I mean, like a serious knockdown.
That's true. That is true.
And just the way that changes your approach. the way that that changes your sort of psychology and what you bring to bear in the ring, I think it's a big thing. So I find this really fascinating that Tua is able to deal with somebody who brings so much to the table as where Ibeabuchi is, young, active, powerful, undefeated, has never figured out how to lose in any way, and totally determined. And somehow Tua's willpower breaks Ibeabuchi by the fourth round, and doesn't break him that it destroys him or anything like that. But you can see he is becoming submissive.
Oh yeah.
And that's the first time it turns. And in my opinion, it never goes back. Ibeabuchi, by the fifth round, I thought Tua is able to land some hooks at the end of that round that are the kind of David Tua hooks that we're used to throughout his career. We get to the sixth round, Tua is much more establishing control and dictating where things are happening, where the punch, like where the exchanges are happening in terms of the geography of the ring. And finally, he's determining the pace of the fight. So at the end of the sixth round, I have it even now. Tua's won 3 in a row on my scorecard, and it's even. And we get to the seventh, and now suddenly Tua is throwing these kind of windmill right hands that begin to land as well. And yet he has enough composure that it's like, I don't need to knock him out. Again, back to Tyson, when he gets nervous, he's trying to knock the person out and gets tired and gets reckless and basic. Tua is not losing his game plan. He's improved his game plan and basically sticks to it for the remainder of the fight. So end of the seventh round, I still have Tua 4-3. He's up. And importantly, last point, is that he's landing over 50% of his punches, and he's out throwing. He's not out throwing Ibeabuchi, but he's landing over 50% of his punches, and he's landing almost twice as many punches as Ibeabuchi by that point in the fight.
In my notes for round 5, like you had said, I'd written that Tua landed 2 left hooks toward the end of the round, and the second of which stood Ike up straight, because it did. The second one they even showed in a replay between rounds where he gets caught kind of off balance a little bit, but is like, he takes the hook and he takes it pretty good. And then again in round 6, right toward the bell, he gets caught with a series of big shots from Tua. And then again in round 7, right at the bell, he gets countered with a really big hook. Right at the bell. And I mean, just because something happens at the bell doesn't mean that fighter automatically wins, but it does leave an impression on the judges. Like it does. Whether you like it or not, it definitely does. Closing a round strong is important. Tua was closing those rounds strong, but even apart from that, he was doing well in the rounds and clearly gaining a momentum. Something else that had happened was Ibeabuchi got warned twice in those rounds for using his shoulder, because something that started happening was when Tua started getting closer and getting at his range so that he could land his hook and his right hand, instead of smothering him, instead of staying in there, because that would have required a high output again. That would have required him to just stay in there punching, because you can't, if you're not going to clinch, you got to do something. And he couldn't do that because his output was clearly dipping. Instead of getting in there like that, like he had been earlier, Ibeabuchi started going boom, boom, and ramming him with his shoulder to try to get him to get back. And the ref was like, hey, bud, nah. And so that obviously prevented him from being able to push Tua off. And I mean, that was big on the ref's part, because I agree with that. Like, you shouldn't be able to forearm, elbow, stiff arm, anything like that, dude. You got to punch a guy off. And if you can't, then you're in trouble. And that's pretty much what wound up happening. Ibeabuchi was in trouble. Like you had said, starting in the 4th round and then onward, basically, it went from Ibeabuchi working to get off of me. Yeah. Like, dude, get off of me. Like, it went from kind of pretty confident to like, hey, can somebody fucking get this guy off of me? And so it changed very quickly. And I agree. So I had round 4, 5, 6, 7 for Tua as well. And then after that round 7, Curtis Cokes, great welterweight champion from the I believe it was 1950s, maybe early 1960s. Point being, great welterweight champion, very, very, very good fighter, and also a really good trainer, tells Ibeabuchi in the corner, you're going to have to make a strong run at this man now. You can't just stand in there. You got to make a run at him. Basically saying, like, dude, you're sliding. And also another thing, I apologize, I forgot about this. I didn't write it down, but I think it was after either the fourth or the fifth round. Um, gosh, I maybe I did write it down, but in any case, even Larry Merchant caught it, and Curtis Coates goes, "Don't quit, like don't quit. You're still in this." And I'm like, dude, it's like the fucking fourth. What do you mean, don't quit?
That's
And
interesting.
Larry Merchant was like, that was a really interesting comment from Curtis Coates between rounds. He said, "Don't quit." So what is he seeing from Ibeabuchi? So obviously Curtis Coates caught it too. It wasn't
Yeah.
just us. We weren't just Mr. fucking crazies about this. We caught it too, that Ibeabuchi's complexion, his mood as far as how he was accepting the fight changed. And so after round 7, Curtis Coates goes, "Hey, dude, you need to do something." And you know what? In round 7 or round 8, Ibeabuchi did. He kind of stepped it up and went back to how he was fighting a little bit. His output went up, and he started fighting his way out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think if you watch Tua's body language, like because I think that's a great point you make about the end of the round body language. Because anybody who's been in there, when you're watching these guys, you're like, oh, it's just 3 minutes. If you've never done any sparring, you're like, it's just 3 minutes. Why are they getting so lazy? Why aren't they? You always hear people that, like, if you're in an apartment or at your home and boxing's on and the action slows with heavyweights, like, this is so boring. Why are they so tired? If you do it, I've had guys that were just tremendous marathon runners who could do all kinds of sports, and suddenly you'd spar with them for a couple rounds. They're exhausted.
Puking,
Yeah, just it's
puking
drawing on
every
so
time.
many, yeah, and drawing on so many things psychically that wear on your stamina that is not the same as other sports.
Panic. You
Yeah,
get
panic,
panicked when you
anxiety.
get exhausted like that, but not just exhausted, but like, dude, there's gloves fucking taped to your hands so you can't do anything, and you're just and then you're tired, but then there's also somebody punching at you. That's
Yeah.
scary. You panic.
It really is, and I think also just that you inescapably have to conflate loss to humiliation in a way that is not like any other sport. Losing the NBA championship is not like losing the heavyweight championship, because you still lose in both cases, but in one you could never be the same. And you're aware of that. You're aware of, I mean, all of these sparring, ring wars, or whatever, the cost that you're living with for the next week, for the next 2 weeks, as a kind of trailer about what the rest of my life could be as a result of this, my brain being beaten in, is a big deal. So there's something about the way Tua approaches this, where at the end of the round, you never see him fighting in a way. Every time you go to a fight where you're close enough live to watch the fighters look up at the big screen to see what the time is left, it's amazing how often you see it. But when you watch fights from the 90s and earlier, they never do it. They just, it's a different mentality. And again, I don't know why that is. I mean, it's not as if, I mean, Sugar Ray Leonard famously would try to win the end of rounds where he would hear the last 10 seconds. But what I mean is there's like a different kind of concern for the end of rounds. And when you're watching Tua, he seems almost like annoyed that it's the end of the round because he wants more time. And nowadays, it's more often than not, I'm seeing guys where they're like relieved that the round is over. God, that took forever. It's a funny like elasticity with rounds about what kind of condition you're in and the opponent you're dealing with. And Tua's body language, I think, begins to get to Ike, as you're saying, at the end of these rounds, the way he's fighting. He does not seem at all concerned by Ike. How many people has Ike ever had stand in front of him who don't look really concerned that they're fighting Ike Ibeabuchi, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody he's ever faced up to this point is like, why is this worth it? What am I
Yeah.
doing?
What is my paycheck again?
Yeah.
1,500?
And Tua
Fuck
is like,
that.
he was like, the round's over. Fuck, I gotta knock this guy out. Like I'm gonna get to him. I'm gonna break him down. And finally, mentally, Ike's body language is not great, but again, he has the fortitude to sort of come back. And I'm liking still his game plan of trying to flurry off of whatever Tua's throwing at him. but he is more submissive. He is backing up. Tua has. It's interesting that he doesn't have more knockouts with his uppercuts because they're vicious, but it would be it's an interesting opponent to face because you don't really know where to be defensively if you're standing in front of him, because he's so comfortable throwing punches with leverage from so many different angles. Even though he's not moving around much, as you say, the torque is there, that he loves to throw 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 punches and fake with things to set them up. So, I mean, as we get to the 10th round, and I'm just going Tua every round. 10th round, the statistic comes up in the fight that there's been more punches thrown so far than Oscar De La Hoya and Pernell Whitaker's entire fight that happened fairly recently around that time. But I mean, I'm having Tua at 7-3. He's up by the end of the 10th round. And yet Ibeabuchi, I think, is putting on a better performance than he was as he was sort of losing confidence. But I don't know what I was watching 25 years ago, where to me it was like Ibeabuchi had this fight in the bag, because rewatching it, I feel like the other way around. They're comparing it to the other big fights in terms of outputs, that it's already becoming historic as a fight in terms of where it's headed and ultimately lands. I don't know. I mean, for me, what's weird about this fight is that it's not talked about more than it is. It's known as a special fight, but it's not really thought of as a historic fight.
I think one of the big issues, and so where I probably differ from you then, is I gave Ike round 8 because I thought that he pulled it out in the last minute or so. HBO crew didn't really mention anything he was doing for some reason. Well, sometimes they just got into that groove, but they didn't really mention anything he was doing in round 8 for some reason. And I thought that he had a very strong closing minute or so of round 8, and he was backing Tua up. So I gave him that round, but I also thought it was somewhat close. But then after that, Tua round 9, Tua round 10, Tua round 11. And then there was 1 or 2 of those rounds that were somewhat close, but not close enough for me to give him the Ike Ibeabuchi. And then round 12, I gave to Ibeabuchi because Tua just kind of started sitting back a little bit too much in that round and didn't throw nearly as much as he had been. So, I mean, I actually had the exact same score as Harold Letterman, which doesn't really happen that often, but I did. But I mean, you know, it was, I think, one of the big issues as far as what you were just now talking about, as far as why this fight is not talked about more, is that neither guy really gets badly hurt, despite and I mean, it's more turn the sound up, and it's more a testament to their chins, because
100%.
these motherfuckers are landing some bombs at a couple points. Like, there's a few points in this fight where, you know, Tua throws a beautiful left hook downstairs and then up, just that double hook, that bam bam. And I mean, considering his body type, how fast he generally is not, I mean, that's just a great fucking combination from him. Bam bam, just wow. And
Yeah.
he landed that probably 5, 6, 7 times on Ike, who didn't even flinch. And then Ibeabuchi, it was even in either the first or second round, Ibeabuchi lands an uppercut that totally snaps to his head back. Couldn't even have given a shit, dude. He would have gone right back to drinking that goddamn daiquiri. Didn't even give a fuck. It was crazy, man. So these guys are landing some bombs on each other and nothing's happening. That's what's one of I think the biggest issue is that neither guy really gets hurt in this fight, despite the punches that are landed. And so for some reason, that lack of drama is not, you know, that's not helpful to the story value of the fight or whatever. But make no goddamn mistake, dude, these guys landed some absolute whistlers, bro.
Yeah. No, and I mean, the weird thing about this fight is where they both go afterwards, because I mean, I liked Harold's score. Again, I had it way more for Tua because I just thought he controlled the fight after he turned it around, being down the first 3 rounds. I thought he conceivably could have won every round after that on my scorecard, even though I understand the activity level of Ibeabuchi, but to me, he just looked like the fighter who's I don't know. I found it really hard to even give him a round. I didn't find many even to be close to being even myself, just
Well,
because I thought Yeah, go
And
ahead.
sorry, but there was something you said earlier that I wanted to respond to that I thought was really interesting because when the last time we had done one of these shows, and I was like, I apologize because we get into a lot of technical stuff thinking people are going to go, ugh. But there were actually a handful of people that went, no, I like that. Do more. And I was like, oh,
Oh,
okay. But I mean, one of the things that that really is interesting is like, technique wise and all that type of shit. It's like the fight's just different. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
there's a lot of stuff going on in there that's anyway. Well, I didn't mean to take away from what you were saying, but it's a good thing that we're getting into the technique portion of it, I think, because a lot of people seem to like it.
Well, just in terms of the chess match of what the fight is, and it's a strange chess match because it's so brutal. As you say, I can't think of a fight that's more brutal that you could call a chess match, but it kind of is in a lot of ways, where Tua does not have an answer for any of the questions that Ibeabuchi's asking in the first 3 rounds, and then it flips. And Ibeabuchi suffers from the same problem that I don't feel like he ever solved. And I don't think he solved in any of the rounds that follow, where it always seemed like the threat was that Tua was finally going to get through on Ibeabuchi after the 3rd round. And he did a handful of times with some hooks where you could see Ibeabuchi was far more aware of Tua's power than the other way around.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not taking anything away from Ibeabuchi. I thought he fought an incredible fight. And I coming away from this, I think we mentioned some of the great fighters from the 1990s. I don't know any of those guys that if he fights them 10 times, he doesn't win at least 5 of them or 4 of them. I don't, if you look at like the people that Lennox Lewis lost to, I mean, it's just 2, but Ibeabuchi would be very challenging for him because of his stamina, because, he's got decent enough reach to keep Lewis honest. He's looks stronger than Lewis. I mean, he's 235 here. We forget Lewis was 250 and a couple inches taller, but still, I like a lot of things that he brings to bear. I mean, fighting Tommy Morrison. I mean, like who could he fight of the great 90s heavyweights where it wouldn't be thrilling to watch? That's another thing is as an opponent, I can't think of many people where it's just like, I need to see what would happen with that based on this guy. Tua going forward after this fight, even though he loses and he's the favorite, and he was the one who was being set up to be the next Mike Tyson and everything. Tua goes on like right back on track. Annihilates Hasim Rahman, gets a tremendous first round knockout against Obed Sullivan, and then gets to Lennox Lewis and is just horribly outclassed. But the important caveat, I think, after Ibeabuchi is the battle with weight really becomes the main opponent in his life for the rest of his career. And we forget that David Tua had like an over 20-year career.
Yeah. Apart from the weight, one of the big issues in his career was Kevin Barry, his manager. He was tied up in litigation for a long time with Kevin Barry, and that kept him inactive. Kevin Barry, of course, is the dude that defeated Evander Holyfield in the Olympics because from the hit on the break. In any case, that really derailed to his career during a time where he needed to stay active. And but I mean, it was already the weight was already a big problem before that. I think the inactivity and then the weight, you could see that he was coming in looking different as a younger fighter, as a younger undefeated heavyweight. He was still massive, but definitely leaner. No question. You could see it just on BoxRec looking at his weights. They start ticking up.
And I don't think I've ever said this publicly before, but when I spent time in Rigondot's corner for a handful of training camps, Ronnie Shields became his trainer after after Freddie Roach. And I think the first question I asked Shields was about this fight. It was about working with David Tua because I really liked David Tua when I first saw him. Like I thought I was desperate to see him fight all of the top people. And just when he got close to winning a championship, it just would never happen, sort of thing. And he just said that Tua was the laziest fighter he ever worked with in terms of the discipline of staying in shape and conditioning. He loved Tua, and Ronnie Shields is a really nice guy. But he just said flat out, he was the laziest person I ever saw in terms of conditioning. And I think that bears out with the rest of his career, that he had enough power and enough kind of, he seems completely unaffected by the stress of fighting that every other fighter suffers from, as you should. Like he's a non-crazy person who just doesn't get stressed by fighting, which is extremely unusual. Because think of, I mean, Ali is another one who did never seem to get stressed fighting. Tyson Fury is somebody that does not seem to get stressed by being in the ring. He looks more comfortable in the ring than he does out in the world. But Tua probably took for granted that he would still be competitive with like very high level heavyweights, even if he wasn't training properly. Now we go to a really dark thing, which is where Ibeabuchi goes after this, because right after this fight, as we're saying, he did take a lot of punches, even though he's credited with scoring the largest amount of punches ever thrown in heavyweight history individually, and cumulatively between the two guys, they both set the record. But after this fight, he complains of, quote, terrible headaches. He's taken to the hospital, MRIs, and very quickly, I mean, only 2 months after this fight, he abducts his former girlfriend's son and with a car slams into a concrete pillar in Austin, Texas, which, according to the criminal complaint, is determined to be sort of a suicide murder attempt. And it doesn't get better after that, unfortunately.
Yeah. The legal portion of that case wound up being that the prosecutor had difficulty proving that he was trying to commit murder and wrote it off as a suicide attempt, basically. And so not much came of it, except for, I believe there was some sort of settlement where he agreed to give the child some six-figure sum, and then a portion,
$500,000 was the sum.
And then a portion of his winnings going forward. And so, but I mean, obviously that stood to be a lot if he had the potential to be heavyweight champion of the world. Not to say that makes it okay, like just to make sure that that's clear. But in any case, yeah, it even went darker from there. Unfortunately, it went downhill from there.
Yeah, it went really downhill. So he adopts this persona, which I loved because it doesn't really mean anything, but it was just kind of fun. He becomes the president. And as like a wrestling name, it's sort of, I'm trying to think of one that the WWF rival, sort of like IRS. I work for the insurance company. You all hate the, paying, not insurance, I mean, paying your taxes.
And I'm the Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah. so I'm the president. So, okay, Ike Ibeabuchi becomes the president from Nigeria. And the problem is that whatever was going on with his like neurochemistry, he began to believe that he actually was the president. And I'm not trying to go into Nigerian prince email scam, but it became this weird thing where his handlers had to sort of coax him into doing things by addressing him in accordance with his regal nature as the president. I don't know if he was the president of Nigeria in his mind, or just maybe the global president, or maybe the American president. But yeah, Lou DiBella said that he really did think he was the president periodically, and sort of demanded that people call him that in a serious way. And yeah, I mean, I'm looking now. DiBella said he wasn't sure if he was the president of the United States, but might have been the president of the entire world. He would go to meetings with HBO where he would act very strangely with a knife. And everybody was very, very concerned about his demeanor and general bearing. And then there's a comeback that happens leading up to the Chris Bird fight, which I remember watching. I think it was live on TV, if I don't remember. Like, I think it was sort of like the HBO After Dark, that in Canada they showed it like as it was live aired.
On TSN.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. The sports network. And I mean, Chris Bird was a fighter. I've heard that he's one of the nicest people in all of boxing, but I hated him as a fighter more than just about any fighter. Just the way he fought, I couldn't stand. And it's not because he wasn't good. He was tremendously good at what he did. I just found him tremendously annoying to watch. So to see that confronted with the kind of punches that Ike Ibeabuchi landed, I fell in love with Ibeabuchi as a fighter, because finally somebody could hit the guy. Bird. It's just sort of like what Floyd Mayweather created, where you could just never hit him cleanly. And I mean, other than like Mosley landing against Floyd, like the guy was never hit. Full credit to him for being that difficult to hit. But that seemed like, again, like a kind of coming out party of, oh my God, if he can beat Tua and beat a Chris Bird, and seeing what Chris Bird was able to do against a lot of very high level fighters in the heavyweight division, it was like, what can Ibeabuchi not do? But then it just gets way, way darker outside the ring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, as you could already see, he's starting to free fall. He's starting to kind of exhibit what would, I guess, in my own dime store psychological perspective, be delusional behavior, kind of suffering what seemed to be breaks from reality at the very least. But then on top of that, so already he's attempted murder suicide with the son of his ex-girlfriend. And then going forward, he continues to have these troubling meetings and interactions with boxing people and also media people and whatnot. And then after the Chris Bird fight, he goes to Las Vegas. I think he actually lived in Las Vegas at this time, if I'm not mistaken. And he basically called a call girl to his room, to his hotel room, and proceeded to assault her. And I mean, the details I know are fairly murky from there, and not necessarily, I mean, I don't necessarily want to fucking comb through the details anyway. But point being, he did some awful shit, scared the absolute bejesus out of this poor lady, and wound up being arrested. And I mean, he tried to like barricade himself in his room, and he tried to, it was bad stuff. And thank goodness nobody was harmed more than they were already. And so he wound up being sent to prison, tried and sent to prison for, I think it was false imprisonment, kidnapping, sexual assault, a bevy of charges, and then threatened with deportation, and then eventually deported. And then I think he came back for, I mean, it's been a long, messy, like I said, the message boards and stuff like that, dude, this has been an ongoing thing for so long, ever since that, especially the Chris Bird fight. And I think especially in the early 2000s, once it became apparent that Chris Bird he was good, and Ibeabuchi kicked his ass, but then he still came back and he was good, Chris Bird.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people a few years after that came to realization, well, damn, where the fuck is this guy? Like we have all of these fighters here. Like he beat David Tua. Many of us don't feel he beat it. And at the time, also, to be fair, the narrative at the time was that Ibeabuchi did not actually beat Tua, and that Tua deserved a close decision. That was honestly the narrative. So a lot of people were kind of unconvinced. But then when he scored that one over Bird, and then Bird also still went on to be good, people were like, well, fuck, what are we missing out on then? And so for a long time, that was kind of that was the resounding hymn. When's Ike Ibeabuchi coming back? When's he coming back? The reality was that obviously he was locked up for a long time and should have been for some really awful shit. And once you are inactive for that amount of time, and then adding to that the psychiatric issues that he suffered, there was never going to be any sort of realistic comeback. And even up to a few months ago, he was talking about still making a comeback. So, recording videos of himself shadow boxing. And thankfully, it doesn't sound like anybody's biting, or perhaps he can't get licensed. But I don't know what's going on. But either way, man, he sure took a dive, and it definitely wound up being a massive what could have been case of a heavyweight who was extremely promising.
Yeah, I mean, he right after this fight that we're talking about, I mean, he began to talk about evil spirits and demons in his
Yeah, the
hotel
whole
room.
religious aspect of it was a whole other thing too. That
Yeah, coming through the air conditioning system. There was one allegation I read that was he was refusing to get into the ring to fight unless he had a Snickers bar. Like he turned down some $1 million fight to fight Michael Grant and some other, I think Jeremy Williams was another opponent, but he clearly something happened in this fight that damaged him or exposed damage that was already there. I mean, if you're already a little off kilter, getting hit in the head by David Tua for 12 rounds in a record-setting punch out foot, probably not the best
Yeah,
thing.
perhaps not great.
Yeah, but I think the world kind of dodged a bullet with what this guy might have done. Had I mean, as bad as it was, I think you're on point that it could have been way worse. That this it's good that this guy went to prison, if not like a mental health facility or something, just to protect society, because something was just really off with him in a lot of ways that at first was viewed as kind of kooky. And I can't believe that he was still allowed to be a free man after that thing with that kid. That kid, by the way, we didn't mention it, but was permanently damaged as a result of that accident. He will never walk properly ever again. So the idea that it was just a civil suit to settle it of $500,000 to me is laughable. I mean, and I mean that just in the sense that I'm
Yeah,
incredulous.
outrageous. Yeah.
Outrageous. It's horrendous, a horrendous indictment on the criminal system to not punish him further for something like that. So I don't know. I mean, back to boxing, leaving aside all this awful shit, I think just kind of doing due diligence, we need to point it out where he went. And but at his peak, I want to ask you as like a boxing historian, when we look at that list of heavyweights that I talked about, I mean, if this guy fought George Foreman around that time, I mean, I think he fucks Foreman up. I think he knocks Foreman out.
It's not totally out of the question, dude. And I mean, you know what? If he's taken, that's not to say that David Tua and George Foreman are equals in terms of punching power. They're different kinds of punchers. But I think that if he's taking David Tua's bombs and that many of them, I think it's safe to say he's probably taken Foreman's shots around this time,
Yeah.
especially given how slow overall Foreman was. And he was at the end too, you know, he was
Yeah.
getting
Yeah.
dinged around. That's another aspect of this was Foreman was taking shots, you know, all throughout his second career. Like he absorbed. So yeah, dude, I think there's a really good chance that Ibeabuchi runs him down and, you know, maybe just ends his career forcibly rather than just kind of forcing him out on a decision or something. Um, yeah, and like I said, extremely formidable, at least formidable looking. And while his resume is not super deep, the names that do stand out are pretty good, dude. They're pretty damn good. You
And
know,
I think you have to just look at also, like, if you think about what happened to Riddick Bowe with Galata, isn't this guy just a better Galata in a lot of ways? And I mean, Galata then, I don't mean what Galata became afterwards, where it became sad. But I mean, I remember watching those two Galata fights against Bowe and just being like, wow, Galata is a force. This is a big guy who punches in combination, who could take a big shot. I mean, think of what Bowe
yeah,
did to guys on the way up to
yeah,
that
dude.
fight.
Watching
And
that fight and being like, oh damn, this guy. Never mind. Never mind.
yeah, just super weird
Oh, he
fights.
looks great. Oh, fuck it. Never mind.
But Bo was completely dominated in both of those fights. And I readily acknowledge that that was not the same Bo that fought Holyfield in the first fight. That was the best Bo ever looked. He looked amazing. But against a Ibeabuchi, I don't know what Bo can really do to keep him off.
If he had been perhaps if he had had a different genetic mental makeup, I don't know what caused it. You know, I don't know if to use a colloquialism, if somebody knocked a screw loose in that Tua fight, I have no idea. But if he had managed to stay straight or whatever you want to call it, he came along at the perfect time. He really did. He came
Yeah.
along at the perfect time to be able to do something. You know, the division was very much in flux at this time. You know, obviously Evander Holyfield was starting to fade out. Mike Tyson was pretty much out by this time. Lennox Lewis was still very much in there, but he had lost to Oliver McCall. And so he had, you know, was still kind of staging a comeback from losing to Oliver McCall, etc. So like there was very much a gap here for Ibeabuchi to step into had he been able to just keep it straight. But that was not his fucking fate, you know?
No, because I feel like if we were managing him and we're looking at this list of great heavyweights of that era, okay, I would keep him away from Lewis because I think Lewis for me is the greatest heavyweight who ever lived.
At
At the end,
least for the time being. Yeah, like he'd need some more to get in with Lewis.
yeah, I just mean I think Lewis brings more to the table as a heavyweight than anybody I've ever seen. I at his best.
In my opinion, taking rounds of right hands from Lewis is different than taking rounds of bombs from Tua. Like, and I mean in a way that Lewis would
Yeah.
take him out.
Yeah.
In my opinion, if it were the same situation and Lewis were allowed to land like that, he'd be taken out.
And he would set him up, and he's got Emmanuel Stewart in his corner to strategize. I mean, the only times he lost. No, well, I mean, the one little question mark there is Lewis took everything he could take from Ray Mercer, and nobody talks about Ray Mercer being one of the great heavyweights or anything. He's very good, but nobody's just like, oh my God, Ray Mercer is a diabolical heavyweight presence. But Lewis really struggled against somebody who's a pretty straightforward problem. And Lewis never really figured out how to deal with it. Now, if you look at the way that he fought Tua, he completely controlled that fight. But I think a lot of that also was the referee and Tua being out of shape, being overweight, being a very different version of himself from this fight. But I don't know how Holyfield could really contain Ibeabuchi. He's just too big, too strong, too active. And you can see when Holyfield meets a guy that tries to counter off of him, he's very uncomfortable.
And he's very physical too. Like Holyfield was a kind of fighter that wanted to physically shut you down. Like,
Yep.
use his gloves to kind of manhandle you and, bring your arms down type of shit. You pull your
Yep.
head. And Ibeabuchi had the physicality that I'm not entirely sure that would have worked real great. Like, I mean, I know it did against Tyson, but Tyson's also a different kind of fighter. Like the style very much comes into play there, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, they're both about the same height. I think Holyfield's about 6'2",
Mm-hmm.
but Ibeabuchi, I mean, remember he's only 24 in this fight, so conceivably, and he's lean. Like, I mean, he's got a full shredded six pack in this fight. Like, I don't know if you'd want him to be 250. I don't know if you'd want him to be a little heavier, but he could very easily if he wanted to. I mean, if this is him where he can sort of do a marathon at this kind of pace, probably you'd have 3 more years of him at this level if he's able to stay in condition. And if that guy is fighting a lot of the top people, I mean, look what David Tua did against Moore when they fought, and think what Moore did against so many heavyweights. Foreman, no, sorry, not Foreman, but I mean Holyfield. Moore was a very dangerous guy, and Tua just annihilated him. Granted, that was a Moore that probably didn't train very well for that fight. But I think he is the great kind of looming what if of this decade is what Ibeabuchi brought to the table. And similarly, it's hard not 25 years looking back to imagine what he would do in today's era, because I do think that the three big guys in the division have been very inflated in their value. I do not think they're anywhere near as good as we talk about them as being. It's just because their resume is just not there in the way that in the 90s you saw what happens when you've got a deep division and people actually fight all the time is they
Exactly.
lose a lot. And the top three
Exactly.
guys never fight. And when they do fight, how did Wilder look in every round where he didn't knock down Fury? Bad. Like I really think if Michael Grant was in that era, he would have been the fourth person in there where it would have been like, oh, he's undefeated and look at how big he is and everything like that. And it takes a Lennox Lewis to expose people like that.
Yeah, I agree. Ibeabuchi would have been right with a lot of these fighters, at least on paper. And using the kind of eye test, he looked good. He looked very good.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a massive shame that his handlers weren't able to keep him contained, and that he himself had the issues that he had. Just awful. So, and also an awful loss too for boxing in that regard, obviously to a lesser extent, but an awful loss for boxing. And David to a much lesser extent, he didn't live up to his potential either, but still had a long, very successful career. and is still today regarded as one of the best heavyweights to never win a world title. And I think that that bears out. At his best, especially, looked very, very good. And this was an example of that for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also important to mention when we're talking about Chris Bird. Chris Bird was undefeated when he fought Ibeabuchi. So, I mean, think of what he did recovering from that fight in terms of getting the victory over Vitaly Klitschko, beating David Tua by unanimous decision, beating Evander Holyfield, Fresakendo, Jamil McCline. Again, some big punchers and that kind of thing. It's instructive about the way that Ibeabuchi was able to handle somebody as slick as Chris Bird at a time when he was undefeated. He was so confident in that fight and just couldn't find a way to deal with Ibeabuchi.
Many wouldn't have. Many wouldn't have. That's what makes us so sad. But
Yeah,
you know what though? One person I'm telling you that Ibeabuchi would not have stood up against, Bobby motherfucking Ches.
that's absolutely true, because I think Ches would recognize with that driving into the concrete, I think you need to come to the Bobby Ches drunken school of driving.
He put the
And
wreck and recognize, that's for sure.
oh, well, I mean, look what Bobby was able to do against Evander Holyfield as his stepping stone to fighting Mike Tyson, which I think was his intent.
Well,
Uh,
he tried to go into the cruiserweight division, but he was drinking a little before that cruise. You know what I mean? I'm reaching. I'm really reaching here.
no, but
Bobby, we love you.
yeah, I don't think I want to see Bobby Ches and Ike Ibeabuchi at that. As much as I have my issues with Bobby Ches, I think that Corey Sanders fight, that was enough retribution.
Yeah. I'm going to be at Canastota this next summer. Bobby's going to show up and kick my ass. I'm going to get fucked up by old Bobby Ches.
Well, just bring your, I don't know, wear like a Menza towel or something.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
brothers. Yeah.
you. Yeah, this was a fun one. This was
Yeah, for sure, man.
it had been a while since I'd revisited it. And I mean, can you think of another fight just before we end where you remembered your scoring one way and it was radically different reviewing it?
I mean, not radically, but yeah. I mean, there have been fights where I've gone back and been like, oh, I guess I scored it a little different. But you know what? Probably another fight we did that I remembered differently when we went back and did it was Leonard Hagler. Was when
Yeah,
I went back, I was for years and years, and I guess I just hadn't rewatched it for a long time, and I just kept thinking, nah, Leonard, he outworked him. Like Hagler didn't do this, or didn't do this, and then when I rewatched it, I was like, man, I thought Hagler won that fight. I thought
yeah.
Hagler won that fucking fight. So for me, it was, but regardless, no, dude, there aren't that many fights where I go back and think that it's really that different. Usually I feel like my first take is pretty, unless I was drunk as fuck or something,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
first take is usually pretty spot on. But I guess it does happen.
I think this was the biggest shift that I've ever seen. Like going back to something where I was like, what the hell was I watching the first time? Because I liked both guys. It wasn't as if just like there was a big bias about who I was rooting for to win. But I remember just thinking Ibeabuchi did way better than it actually seemed in looking back at it. I thought my stock in Tua went way higher about what might have been with him, which is not the takeaway I had then. It was, oh my God, what is Ibeabuchi going to do in the heavyweight division? Not so much Tua. Tua, I thought I kind of, okay, he's got that amazing hook, and if he's able to land it, he's in trouble. But like, look what Lewis did to him. That's kind of what would have happened. Is people could figure him out and control him. He was limited in a sense, but boy, he did not look limited in this fight. I think he deserves a lot more credit for what he did here.
I agree. And had he gotten this decision, I mean, that doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying that if he gets this decision, then magically he's able to beat Lennox Lewis. But nonetheless, it could have changed the career trajectory. Maybe it could have given him the motivation to stay in shape. I don't know.
It's true. It's really interesting. That's a really good point. That if he wins this fight, could the trajectory have been changed in terms of the opponent selection? Because would it have meant that HBO would have got more behind him to fight some of the top people they had? Would there be more incentive and more money for bigger name people to accept a fight with him? I don't know, because I mean, as you're saying, and I think on YouTube, I was going to mention this. YouTube, you can watch some of his sparring with Holyfield. It's amazing.
Mhm. Oh yeah, that's like an hour-long session, dude. It's
Yeah,
fucking good. It's real good, actually. There's like a couple of rounds where it's like, whoa, they're
yeah,
going in.
yeah. They're going really hard. So Yeah, fascinating two guys, fascinating sort of counterfactual trajectories that might have been, but the way it played out, I think it deserves a lot more attention than it gets, even though it's this record-breaking historic fight statistically, but it's a lot more.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot going on there, and it's always fun to go through the kind of backstory and weave through what's going on behind the scenes a little bit and kind of set this up. So I appreciate you doing the homework and doing the reading up and whatnot because this is a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
Definitely, definitely do it again soon.
Well, everybody who listened in, thank you. We appreciate you. If you listened in through all these podcasting apps, please go ahead and subscribe and leave a review. If you watched on YouTube, hello, thank you so much. And also subscribe on YouTube. That is appreciated. Leave a comment and whatnot. As far as social media goes, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on both Instagram and Facebook, but it's also on Twitter, at least as long as Twitter is a thing. Who fucking knows how long that will be the case? But speaking of Twitter, my boy Brin-Jonathan Butler is on there as Brinicio, Brinicio, and me, Patrick Connor. I'm there as Patrick M. Connor. Say hello, and Bryn, we'll talk soon, bro.
You got it, man. Take care of yourself.
Later, everybody.